There's a phone call that Al Capone received on February 7th, 1929, that made him smile. Not a happy smile. The kind of smile that meant someone had just made the last mistake of their life. Capone was sitting in his suite at the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, eating breakfast, reading the morning newspapers. He was 30 years old, at the absolute peak of his power, controlling bootlegging operations across Chicago, worth an estimated $100 million annually, roughly $1.7 billion in 2026 dollars. The phone rang. His associate, Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, answered it, listened for a moment, then covered the receiver. "Boss," Jake said, "it's one of our guys from the north side. Says Bugs Moran was running his mouth at a speakeasy last night." "About what?" Capone asked, not looking up from his newspaper. "About you." "Called you." Jake hesitated. "Called you a fat, greasy dago who couldn't run a lemonade stand without screwing it up." Capone set down his newspaper slowly. "Is that right?" That's what he said in front of maybe 20 people. His crew, some neutrals. Made a whole show of it. What else did he say? Jake read from notes he'd scribbled. "Said you were overrated. Said the only reason you had power was because you bought off cops instead of earning respect. Said if it came to a real war, you'd run back to New York with your tail between your legs." Capone was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, set it down carefully. "Call Jack McGurn," Capone said. "Tell him I want to see him. Today." "What are you thinking, boss?" Capone looked at Jake with those cold eyes that had made him one of the most feared men in America. "I'm thinking," Capone said quietly, "that Bugs Moran needs to learn what happens when you disrespect Al Capone." 7 days later, on February 14th, 1929, Valentine's Day, 7 members of Bugs Moran's crew would be dead. Lined up against a garage wall and executed by men dressed as police officers in what would become the most famous mob hit in American history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This is the story of what happened when a gangster made the fatal mistake of publicly insulting Al Capone. The story of how one night of drunken disrespect triggered a response so brutal, so calculated, so shocking that it made headlines around the world. The story of the 7 men who died because their boss couldn't keep his mouth shut. By 1929, Al Capone was the undisputed ruler of Chicago's criminal underworld. He controlled bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets across the entire city. He had politicians on his payroll, police officers who looked the other way, judges who dismissed cases against his men. Capone had come to Chicago in 1919, sent by his mentor Johnny Torrio to help run the city's growing bootlegging operations during Prohibition. When Torrio retired in 1925 after surviving an assassination attempt, Capone took over the entire organization. What made Capone different from other gangsters was his business acumen. He understood that running a criminal empire required the same skills as running any large corporation: organization, delegation, strategic planning, and ruthless elimination of competition. By 1929, Capone's organization employed over 700 men. His operations generated approximately $100 million in annual revenue. He owned breweries, speakeasies, gambling houses, brothels. He controlled unions, construction contracts, police departments. Capone lived like a king. His suite at the Lexington Hotel took up 2 entire floors. He wore custom suits that cost $5,000 each, roughly $85,000 in $26. He drove bulletproof Cadillacs. He dined at the finest restaurants, attended the opera, threw parties that lasted for days. But underneath the sophistication was something brutal. Capone had risen to power through violence. He'd personally participated in murders, beatings, intimidation. He understood that in his world, respect was maintained through fear. And when someone disrespected him, the response had to be immediate, overwhelming, and public. Which brings us to George Bugs Moran. George Clarence Moran was born on August 21st, 1893, in Minnesota. By 1929, at age 35, he was the leader of the North Side Gang, the primary rival to Capone's operations in Chicago. Moran was called Bugs because other gangsters thought he was crazy, reckless, unpredictable, willing to take risks that more cautious criminals avoided. He was also arrogant, loud, and increasingly resentful of Capone's dominance. The North Side Gang controlled bootlegging operations in the northern part of Chicago. They were not as large or as powerful as Capone's organization, but they were still significant. They made good money. They had their own territory. And Bugs Moran believed he deserved the same respect as Al Capone. The problem was, Chicago wasn't big enough for both of them. Throughout the 1920s, the Capone organization and the North Side Gang had engaged in a low-level war, hijacking each other's liquor shipments, muscling in on each other's speakeasies. Occasional shootings when tensions boiled over. But for the most part, they maintained an uneasy peace. Capone controlled the South Side. Moran controlled the North Side. And they tried to stay out of each other's way. That changed in early 1929. Capone had been expanding aggressively. He wanted control of the entire city, not just his current territory. He'd started making moves into North Side territory, opening new speakeasies, bribing Moran's suppliers, offering better deals to distributors who'd been working with the North Side Gang. Moran was furious. He saw it as disrespect, as Capone refusing to honor the boundaries they'd established. He started pushing back, hijacking Capone's trucks, threatening Capone's speakeasy operators, trying to defend his territory. The tension escalated. Both sides knew a major confrontation was coming. It was just a matter of when and how. Then, on the night of February 7th, 1929, Bugs Moran made a crucial mistake. The Green Mill Cocktail Lounge was a speakeasy in the North Side, one of Moran's establishments. On February 7th, Moran was there with about a dozen of his top men, celebrating what he considered a victory. They'd just hijacked a major shipment of Canadian whiskey that had been destined for Capone's operations. They were drinking heavily. Moran, especially. By midnight, he was drunk and feeling invincible. That's when someone made the mistake of mentioning Al Capone's name. "I heard Scarface is pissed about the whiskey," one of Moran's men said, using Capone's hated nickname. Moran laughed. Scarface can be pissed all he wants. What's he gonna do? That fat, greasy dago couldn't run a lemonade stand without screwing it up. The men around him laughed. Encouraged, Moran continued. Everyone thinks Capone's some kind of genius. You know why he's got power? Because he buys it. He pays off cops, pays off politicians, pays off everyone. He doesn't earn respect. He buys it. If it came to a real war, man to man, he'd run back to New York with his tail between his legs. More laughter. Moran was on a roll now. And another thing, Moran said, his voice getting louder. Capone thinks he's some kind of businessman, thinks he's sophisticated because he wears nice suits and goes to the opera. But underneath all that, he's just a Brooklyn street thug who got lucky. I got more class in my pinky finger than Scarface has in his whole fat body. The problem with Moran's performance was that he wasn't just talking to his own men. The Green Mill was crowded that night. Other patrons, including a few who were neutral in the Capone-Moran rivalry, heard everything. By the next morning, word of Moran's insults had reached Capone's organization. By noon, Capone himself had been told, and by 2 p.m., Capone had made a decision. Bugs, Moran, had to go. And the hit needed to be spectacular. Needed to send a message so loud that no one else would ever publicly disrespect Al Capone again. Capone called a meeting of his top lieutenants on February 8th. Present were Jack Machine Gun McGurn, Capone's chief enforcer, Frank Nitti, Capone's financial mastermind, and several other trusted associates. Bugs Moran's got a big mouth, Capone said. Too big. Time to shut it permanently. You want him killed? McGurn asked. I want him dead. I want his top men dead. I want the North Side gang destroyed. I want it done in a way that everyone sees, everyone talks about, everyone remembers. When? Soon. Within a week. I want this done before Moran has time to realize he made a mistake. McGurn nodded. I'll handle it. How? Capone asked. I got an idea, but I'm going to need some specific things. Police uniforms, a stolen police car, and information on where Moran and his crew meet regularly. You'll have everything you need, Capone said. Just make sure it's clean. Make sure there's no way it traces back to us. Over the next 6 days, McGurn planned one of the most elaborate mob hits in history. He recruited the shooters, 4 men, all experienced killers, all loyal to Capone. He obtained police uniforms from a corrupt cop on Capone's payroll. He stole a police car from an unguarded lot. He gathered intelligence on the North Side gang's routines, their meeting places, their schedules. He learned that Moran and his top men often met at a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. The garage was owned by the SMC Cartage Company, but it was actually a front for the North Side gang's liquor storage and distribution operations. McGurn also learned that the gang usually gathered there around 10:30 a.m. on weekday mornings to discuss business, count money, plan operations. Perfect. McGurn set the date, February 14th, Valentine's Day. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Capone was going to give the North Side gang a Valentine's Day present they'd never forget. Plan was simple, but brilliant. 4 men would arrive at the garage in a stolen police car, dressed in police uniforms. They'd enter the garage, line up Moran and his men against the wall, as if conducting a police raid, something that happened regularly during Prohibition. Then, once the targets were disarmed and compliant, the shooters would open fire. By the time real police arrived, the shooters would be long gone. And because witnesses would report seeing men in police uniforms, the initial investigation would focus on corrupt cops, not on Capone's organization. It was perfect. Almost too perfect. Valentine's Day, 1929, dawned cold and clear in Chicago. Temperature around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow on the ground from a storm the week before. At the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street, 7 men gathered for their regular morning meeting. They were Frank Gusenberg, one of Moran's top enforcers; Pete Gusenberg, Frank's brother, also an enforcer; Albert Kashelek, also known as James Clark, Moran's second-in-command; Adam Heyer, the gang's accountant, Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who hung around gangsters for excitement; Albert Weinshank, who managed several speakeasies for the gang; John May, a mechanic who worked on the gang's trucks. Notably absent, Bugs Moran himself. He was running late that morning, delayed by traffic. At 10:30 a.m., a police car pulled up outside the garage. 4 men in police uniforms got out. 2 uniformed officers. 2 in plain clothes, but with police badges visible. They entered the garage through the front door. "Police!" one of them shouted. "Everyone against the wall! This is a raid!" The 7 men inside weren't surprised. Police raids were common. Usually they resulted in confiscated alcohol, maybe some small fines, nothing serious. The men knew the routine. They put down their weapons, raised their hands, lined up against the north wall of the garage. That's when everything changed. The police officers pulled out Thompson's submachine guns, 2.45 caliber Tommy guns, the kind of weapons that could fire 600 rounds per minute. And they opened fire. The shooting lasted approximately 90 seconds. In that time, the 4 shooters fired over 150 rounds into the 7 men lined against the wall. The Tommy guns made a distinctive sound, a rapid, thunderous chatter that could be heard for blocks. Neighbors would later describe it as sounding like a car backfiring repeatedly, or like someone hammering very fast. The 7 men didn't have time to react. They were facing the wall, hands up, thinking this was just another police raid. The bullets hit them from behind, tearing through bodies, ricocheting off the brick wall, creating a scene of absolute carnage. Frank Gusenberg was hit 14 times. Pete Gusenberg, 10 times. The others, similarly, massive trauma. Instant or near-instant death for most of them. The shooters didn't check to make sure everyone was dead. They just fired until their magazines were empty, then walked out calmly. As they left the garage, 2 of them, still in police uniforms, held their weapons on the 2 shooters in civilian clothes, as if they'd just arrested them. This was part of the plan. Anyone watching would think the police had arrived, arrested the shooters, and the situation was under control. They got in the police car and drove away. The entire operation, from entering the garage to leaving, took less than 5 minutes. Inside the garage, the 7 men lay in pools of blood. 6 of them were dead or dying. The 7th, Frank Gusenberg, was somehow still alive, despite 14 bullet wounds. The first person to discover the massacre was a woman named Jeanette Landisman, who lived in a boarding house next to the garage. She'd heard the gunfire, but like many Chicagoans during Prohibition, assumed it was either a police raid or gangsters shooting at each other. Neither was uncommon. But the silence afterward bothered her. Usually, there were sirens shouting something. This time, nothing. She looked out her window and saw the police car driving away, saw the garage door still open, saw something red on the snow near the entrance. She called the real police. 2 patrol officers arrived at 10:50 a.m., 20 minutes after the shooting. They entered the garage and found a scene unlike anything they'd seen in their careers. 7 bodies, blood everywhere, the smell of gunpowder and death, bullet casings covering the floor. The brick wall behind the bodies pockmarked with hundreds of bullet holes. One of the officers ran outside and vomited. The other officer knelt beside Frank Gusenberg, who incredibly was still alive, barely. Blood pumping from multiple wounds. "Who did this?" the officer asked. "Who shot you?" Frank Gusenberg, adhering to the gangster code even while dying, whispered, "Nobody shot me." Those were his last words. He died en route to the hospital. News of the massacre spread through Chicago within hours. By afternoon, it was national news. By evening, international. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, as it would come to be known, was front-page news around the world. 7 men executed in broad daylight in a carefully planned hit that looked like a police operation. It was shocking even for Chicago, a city that had become synonymous with gangland violence during Prohibition. The Chicago Police Department launched the largest criminal investigation in the city's history. Dozens of detectives assigned, hundreds of interviews conducted, every clue followed. They knew immediately this was mob-related. The victims were all connected to the North Side gang. The sophistication of the hit suggested professional killers. The police uniforms suggested someone with connections to law enforcement. Everyone suspected Al Capone. But suspecting and proving were different things. Capone had an alibi. He was in Florida on Valentine's Day, meeting with the district attorney of Dade County, the exact time of the massacre. He'd made sure dozens of people saw him there, including law enforcement officials who could testify to his whereabouts. The police interviewed Capone anyway. He expressed shock and sadness at the massacre. "I'm as surprised as you are," Capone told investigators. "This is terrible. Bad for business, bad for everyone. I hope you catch whoever did this." "You didn't order it?" "I was in Florida. I don't even know these guys who got killed. They worked for Bugs Moran. So, I got no beef with Bugs Moran. We stay in our territories. He stays in his. Why would I want him dead?" The police had no answer. More importantly, they had no evidence. The shooters had left no fingerprints. The police car and uniforms were generic, untraceable. Witnesses gave conflicting descriptions of the men they'd seen. The investigation stalled, eventually went cold. No one was ever charged with the St. Valentine's Day massacre. But everyone knew who'd ordered it. Moran had been late to the garage that morning. He was about a block away when he saw the police car pull up. Saw men in police uniforms enter. Being a wanted man with multiple warrants, Moran decided to avoid the police raid. He turned around and left. That decision saved his life. When Moran learned what happened, that his 7 top men had been massacred, that he'd been the target but had escaped through pure luck, his response was immediate and public. Only Capone kills like that, Moran told reporters. Only that greaseball would have the guts to do something like this. He's a beast. He's inhuman. And someday, someone's gonna kill him the same way he killed my boys. But privately, Moran knew he was finished. His top men were dead. His organization was crippled. And he'd learned a harsh lesson about publicly insulting Al Capone. Within a year, Moran had lost control of the North Side gang. Within 5 years, he'd left Chicago entirely, moved to Ohio. He spent the rest of his life as a small-time criminal, robbing banks, getting arrested, serving time. Bugs Moran died in prison in 1957 at age 63, serving a sentence for bank robbery. From the most powerful gangster in North Chicago to dying in a prison cell, a cautionary tale about the consequences of disrespecting the wrong person. The St. Valentine's Day massacre didn't just destroy the North Side gang, it destroyed Al Capone. Not immediately. In the short term, Capone won. He consolidated control over all of Chicago's bootlegging operations. The North Side gang collapsed. No other gangs challenged him. He was the undisputed king of Chicago. But the massacre brought heat, intense, national, sustained heat. The federal government, which had largely ignored prohibition-related violence, couldn't ignore this. 7 men executed in broad daylight in what looked like a police operation? That was too much. The feds started investigating Capone seriously, not just for bootlegging or murder. Those were hard to prove. They went after his finances, his taxes, his money. In 1931, 2 years after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Capone served his sentence in Atlanta, then Alcatraz. The syphilis he'd contracted years earlier destroyed his brain. By the time he was released in 1939, he was a shell of his former self. Al Capone died on January 25, 1947, at age 48. The St. Valentine's Day massacre, his response to Bugs Moran's insult, had been the beginning of the end. The 7 men who died on February 14, 1929, weren't innocent. They were gangsters, criminals who'd chosen a life of violence. They'd participated in murders, robberies, extortion. They weren't victims in the traditional sense. But they died because their boss had insulted Al Capone. They died because Bugs Moran, drunk and arrogant, had called Capone a fat, greasy dago in a crowded speakeasy. 7 men, 7 families destroyed, 7 funerals, 7 widows, and dozens of children left behind, all because of an insult. The garage at 2122 North Clark Street was demolished in 1967. The bricks from the wall where the 7 men were killed were sold to collectors. Some of them are reportedly displayed in various mob museums around the country. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remains the most famous mob hit in American history. It's been depicted in dozens of movies, TV shows, documentaries. It's taught in history classes as an example of Prohibition-era violence. But the real lesson of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre isn't about prohibition or gangsters or violence. The real lesson is about the cost of disrespect, about how words have consequences, about how insulting the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time can trigger a response so disproportionate, so overwhelming, so permanent that it echoes through history. Bugs Moran called Al Capone a fat, greasy dago. A week later, 7 people were dead. Moran's organization was destroyed, and Capone's response to that insult eventually led to his own downfall. Everyone lost. The 7 men who died. Bugs Moran, who lost everything he'd built. Al Capone, who ended up dying in prison. His mind destroyed by disease. All because of one night. One drunken insult. One moment of disrespect that spiraled into the most infamous massacre in American criminal history. That wraps it up for today. On February 7th, 1929, Bugs Moran got drunk and publicly insulted Al Capone. Called him a fat, greasy dago who couldn't run a lemonade stand. Said Capone bought respect instead of earning it. Said if it came to real war, Capone would run back to New York. 7 days later, on Valentine's Day, 7 of Moran's top men were lined against a garage wall and executed by men dressed as police officers. Over 150 bullets fired in 90 seconds. The most famous mob hit in American history. All because Bugs Moran couldn't keep his mouth shut. Moran survived, but lost everything: his organization, his power, his future. He died in prison decades later, a nobody. And Capone? The heat from the massacre eventually led to his conviction and imprisonment. Everyone lost. 7 men dead. 2 empires destroyed. All from one insult. If this story hit you, drop a comment below. Subscribe for more stories where words have consequences and disrespect costs everything. See you in the next one.